It seems that behind every corner in contemporary culture, we hear of a new community, a new binding ethos by which people surround themselves around. And we consider in history, the threads that bind us are not so simple. So long as mankind has tried to live in harmony with one another or in conflict, we have had rules, normative concepts, things that we decide are a part of our culture. And when we consider these things, we also get to look at both how those principles connect us to one another and how our connection to one another produces those principles. Those who are familiar with those who talk about the military, who talk about language that goes into the movies and the aspects and our conversations between one another when it comes to the veterans experience, we are so inundated with the idea of camaraderie that we may perhaps take it for granted. And as gun culture and the West, or at least the microcosm that we are referring to as gun culture, continues to sort of expand and blend into more Americana, and as we listen to the way that we talk about things, we recognize that that desire for camaraderie is not exclusive to those who have been in the military. Once again, the veil, if that were even a appropriate term, is torn between those who did something and those who live in a country. The citizens, the veterans, the people. And so while the Redacted Culture Cast does tend to focus on aspects and attitudes and conversations within gun culture, it also is something that we see in the greater expanse of at least the West, or English-speaking peoples, if you wanted to go in a Churchill direction. And so before we get any further in, if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. That's where we're going to join into the conversation and be part of our discussions. And then if you want to be a supporter of the channel in another way, you can head over to our shop at redactedllc.com. You can pick up our merch. We are doing the pre-sale on our original shirts and hoodies. Advertisements aside, this show is provided by, sponsored, and ran by you and the things that you choose to support us, so we thank you for that. Communities and cults, tribes and tribalism, these terms are commonly slung around like weapons, hooked with barbs intended to drag our interlocutors down into a fight that no one can win. At the same time, the idea of tribe may have given way to a more socially acceptable term like community in our current era. We can look at time, and we can look at even how these different subcultures have adapted the use of that language, but one thing I want to begin with is a story. Around the time that I was leaving the military, which at this point in time is 10 years ago, there was a mass exodus in the unit that I was a part of. And that mass exodus was caused by a multitude of factors, but no small part of those was played by a lack of sense of camaraderie, a lack of direction being provided by leadership. Some of us saw that the opportunities to go on deployments was starting to dry up, and so we didn't want to live in a garrison lifestyle. There were decisions being made that didn't seem very reasonable to the warfighter. You had a loss of skin in the game by those who were making the rules. The rules of engagement being passed down were ones that could only be described as unethical, not because they inappropriately targeted the opponent, but they set the man who was paid and hired and trained to do the job in such a disadvantageous position that they almost felt like they were choosing between the prison cell and suicide. So that was one factor amongst many, but what we all expected by this time, and what many of us expected because of where we were at in that timeline that was called the Global War on Terror, we were certainly not the first people getting out of the military, and at that time, there was a very clear awareness that people who got out of the military were going to have to go through a period of maybe suffering or loneliness where they no longer felt they had that connection to their immediate community. This happens when you move from one neighborhood to another, from one state to another, from one job to another, from one position to another. But in that scenario, even the society around us, the American culture, had taken it as assumed that those who were going to get out of the military were going to have to go through that period where they didn't feel as connected to where they were at. There was the loss of brotherhood, the loss of camaraderie. And so when I left the military, and I in some ways cheated because I continued to I continued to deploy with a private matter, there was a time where this happened, where after the deployments and after that kind of work, and even after being in college, there was a time where even I felt unmoored. I didn't have I felt alone in a sense. But when I opened my eyes and looked out beyond my own circumstances, I recognized that it wasn't just myself that was in that scenario. It was other veterans. And then even beyond that, it was so many of the young men in the world, in America at that time, felt completely disconnected from their environment. They didn't have that sense of camaraderie and brotherhood that people in the military sometimes claim to have, but they also were representing the examples of what it looks like when somebody may have had something or even an expectation of it, and that expectation not being met. This was eventually reflected across different parts of society when, in conversations with people who were more in support of the riots during 2020, would admit that they felt disenfranchised from not only their neighborhood, but their country as a whole. And this sense of disenfranchisement, of not being committed to something, of not being a part of something greater than yourself, might be one of the most distinguishing factors of our era. That we have millions of people who live in this country but do not feel a part of it. How they come to that conclusion varies, but at least that's consistent. Across the United States and much of the West, the people who live there, who call themselves citizens, very often don't feel a part of their environment. They are the stranger in the strange land. And so it's natural for us to see writing about this in books and language being used, sometimes in divisive marketing techniques, and sometimes in political jargon, and sometimes in pseudo-spiritual enlightenment-like speech that talks about being a part of a tribe. And then tribe was a hot word, it was a buzzword, it was a keyword, it was something that people searched for both on Google and in their communities. And when they didn't find it, they cried out in exasperation. But then you would also see the word tribalism pop up, and it was used to attack people, that he's just being tribalistic. This is just American political tribalism. And we might want to suffer through distinguishing and understanding what we're talking about. Tribe and tribalism are two different terms. They mean different things, but they have a similarity, and of course that's beyond language. But a tribe, what is it about a tribe that is attractive to people, and should they be attractive to that? Can you be an independent free thinker but also part of a tribe is the key question in this environment. But historically speaking, tribe has been used to describe, or the word tribe has been used in a descriptive sense to identify a group of people, very oftentimes or most oftentimes connected by familial ties, but then also has, extra familial attachments, adopted uncles, connected family members, very close friends, confidants, and so forth. But there's something about tribe in history that has both a historical component to its time, or its point in time, We can talk about the tribes of Israel, the tribes of Judah, the tribes in this country, the tribes on that continent, or even in our current time, uncontacted tribes in the insert remote area here. And so a tribe is a word that is so often used, that has been so often used in a sort of pseudo-marketing sense, but we shouldn't lose sight of what it means and how it differs from what we'd consider tribalism. A tribe, in this sense, can be a familial tie, but it's usually a description of a group of people that are connected in some way. They have a shared history. They have a shared, maybe even lineage, but they have a shared history, some shared concept that isn't an abstract ideal, but something that is more spatiotemporal. It's more connected by location, physicality. It's more connected by their timeline, their genealogy, the shared history of a people. If you were to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I believe that's it, where the author sort of connects the history of the English at this time, to the fall of Troy, and that the English were the survivors, those people who left Troy after its collapse and created a new country. I'm paraphrasing a bit, so don't judge me too hard on that. And so oftentimes when we see around tribe, we see this idea of collected history, which makes sense why it would connect into military cultures, because being a part of something like, say, the 75th Regiment means that you're part of a long lineage of historical figures who have done certain things that are worthy of note. But how does that differentiate from tribalism? And how does tribe change? In a sense, tribalism can be voluntary, but is not necessarily voluntary. You can be a part of a tribe simply by being born into that tribe. And then there are options for people to join in it as well. Tribalism, or not tribalism, but tribe itself oftentimes has a sense of an honor system attached to it, that there is the way that we do things in this family, the way that we do things in this circle. And then there is tribalism. And tribalism is something that I think we can define in a pretty straightforward way. But tribalism is abdicating one's responsibility to morality by simply choosing whatever is best for the group. Tribalism is choosing not to concern yourself with whether or not an action is moral, but more or less defer that decision purely to a potential good outcome for the tribe, for the group. It doesn't mean that it can't be sacrificial, it doesn't mean that it cannot be beneficial in some way, but tribalism is, in a sense, when somebody chooses to abdicate their responsibility, their own agency, and they don't do it, and there's oftentimes a component of it that includes more of an abdication of responsibility rather than recognizing it, making that decision, and then subjugating it. But there's this abdication of saying, I don't need to make a decision because I'm just going to do what's best for the tribe. It's just best for my people. Whether or not that is actually true may differ, and whether or not it being quote-unquote best for your people is also the right thing to do. What happens when you sacrifice your agency? What happens when you sacrifice your agency, your ability to make decisions, your mind, in a sense, to the tribe, is that you will eventually, maybe even immediately, lose the ability to even evaluate what that means. It's primarily an abdication, and not in a good light. An abdication, a refusal, a shrugging off of your responsibilities and giving it to somebody else because it's better. It's easier for you to do that than to think about what you're doing. So a tribe has a sense that there is a connection, there is a shared history, whereas tribalism is even in an easy political sense, abdicating any sense of morality to rather whatever is good for the group. And sometimes people have to humble themselves and recognize, I may not be able to make the best decision, so I will defer that to the group, but abdication and deferment are different things. And then we get to community. And community in our in this circle, in this conversation, is sometimes is in danger of just being a more modern version of tribe. Tribe is too exclusionary for our conversation, so let's just use the word community. We don't want to talk about the LGBTQ tribe because we want to be able to invite people in. The gun culture is a community-based movement, not a tribal-based movement, because we don't want to be so isolationist about what we think is true. We need to be able to open our doors for more people. These are just generalizations. But what is the difference between community over here, right? What is the difference between community and tribe? On the one hand, we could basically distill it down to choice, is to voluntary participation. You do not get to be a part of a community unless you volunteer to be part of that community. You do not get to be a part of a community without paying your entrance fee, your dues, your participation. And sometimes that due is that you need to treat it like it is real and you are a part of it and your actions have consequences for more than just yourself. So a community is, even in the language of it, involves much more of a voluntary concept to it, which is funny because the way that we misuse the word community is when we fail to distinguish a community from a cult. But let's go back to tribe and community. All tribes are in an essence a type of community, but not all communities are actually a tribe. All German shepherds are dogs, but not all dogs are German shepherds. So in that sense, the community is a broader term, a bigger tent, but it also incorporates and it relies a little bit more, quite a bit more, on the voluntary participation of its citizens, of its people. And this is where gun culture goes wrong very often, is that we want to, it's where we go wrong very often because we try to dance on this line between expecting people to have some sort of rite of passage into the group, but denying the fruit of that rite of passage. This is where we have a challenge between wanting there to be some standard by which we're considered in community. We want our peers to be actually peers, but then when we corrupt that sense of commitment into something else, it very quickly turns into what we might call gatekeeping, where the rules by which you participate in it are not actually the real rules, they're just something else, where the terms for being a part of the community do not accurately reflect the values of the community. I think in this time, as it's going to get brought up again, and it has been brought up again, gatekeeping is a term that needs to be better defined, because otherwise it is simply the complaint of those who have been sorted out. I'll have to do one on the defense of gatekeeping, but that's for another time. So let's stick back to tribe and tribalism, cult and community. So a tribe oftentimes is dependent on a collected history that one can volunteer to become a part of, they can join into, but there is this collected history approach to it. There might be a genealogical aspect to it. Tribalism is the abdication of one's individual agency and thought for whatever might be considered the best of the tribe in the short term. Then you have community, which is an interconnection of peoples on a voluntary basis. And then there is cult. Cult is a difficult word for many people to deal with in the 21st century because those people have made the mistake by believing that there are religious and non-religious people. So long as you believe in religious and non-religious people, you will be intellectually incapable of addressing the problem with cults. And this is just going to be, it's going to be easier to describe, but let's go into it. A cult consists of a social aspect and a let's call it theological aspect. But the social aspect is oftentimes explained away and blamed on the theology aspect of it, the moral code, the argument, whatever. And so a cult can consist of, and oftentimes is painted in the picture of, being a religious extremist organization. But if you fundamentally believe that there is a difference between religious and non-religious people, you lack the proper tools to evaluate that. Because a religion is the thing that people have, that each individual carries with them, this system, this abstract object, which is by the method by which they evaluate, or they make moral evaluations. If you believe that a person can achieve a moral code without any system by which to build that code, then that is absurd. We all believe in some sense of morality. Maybe let's just use sociopaths aside, but that's probably as simple as whatever I want right now. We all have a system by which we make moral evaluations, whether my actions are good, whether that person's actions are good, whether this is the right thing to do or this is the wrong thing to do. We all have a system by which we make those evaluations. And so we all have a sense of a religion. We all have some sense of where we derive meaning and purpose, telos, direction. We might not be aware of it. We may be in search of it. We may desire it. We may be instituted in one. We may be, indoctrinated into one. The Ranger Indoctrination Program. We may be indoctrinated into one, but that alone is dependent on a metaphysic that understands how people derive meaning and moral decisions. And so if you believe that people can be non-religious, you're saying that they are amoral. They are incapable of having a moral perspective. And, well, that's kind of what we call sociopathy in some ways, but there's more to it. Or psychopathy, however you want to say it. It's kind of fun. So in that sense, we need to discuss what a cult would look like. What is the social structure and perhaps the religious structure as well. The social structure of a cult is easy to see but sometimes difficult to describe. It's easy to see but then can be difficult to differentiate because the social structure of a cult oftentimes is conflated with an organized religion, and then it's given some sort of moral badness to it. We say it's bad because it's a cult, because it might be authoritarian, because it might be controlling, because it might be too demanding of its participants, because it might be non-voluntary. But there are traits of cults that are intriguingly consistent. One of them being, to those within the cult, they abhor they abhor the apostate more than the non-believer. It is more offending to those within the cult for somebody to join in the community and then volunteer to leave. That is a consistency that is not unique to a cult-like environment, but a cult particularly is dependent solely on the actions of secret knowledge. A cult is one thing that distinguishes cults from religions is that cults are based on it doesn't distinguish them. What makes a cult more unique than within any sort of religious framework is that cults are determined by secret knowledge and oftentimes are wrapped up in a sense of mysticism, whether that is a pseudoscientific mysticism or a pseudo-religious mysticism is just one of two options. But a cult is, in a sense, also much less voluntary. You are not allowed to leave the cult. You are not allowed to disagree with the cult. You are not allowed to challenge its hegemony. You are not allowed to oppose it. And the cults are oftentimes a distortion of something that is, a cult is usually a word to describe something that is a distortion of something that is more true. So a community and a cult are different from each other. And how does a cult separate itself from culture? Is because a cult denies the agency of the individual, instead forces, like tribalism, commitment to the cult beyond commitment to any higher power. It is more important within a cult for people to serve the cult than it is for people to serve whatever it is that is supposedly informing the cult of what is right. So, in the same way that tribalism is the abdication of agency in favor of the tribe, a cult is the prohibition of agency because of the community. One is an abdication. It's where the individual chooses not to bear the responsibility that he has because he exists. And the other one is the use of the structure, the social structure of the community to prohibit or abolish the agency of the individual. It's a bit technical, but I hope it's useful for you. So let's go back, let's look at history. One of the challenges that the Roman world, especially around the rise of Christianity, had with Christianity itself, is that in the Roman world, you had the sort of the divinity of Caesar. You had this idea that Caesar's rule was absolute. Now, how much of that was viewed as a metaphysical and therefore sort of religious reality in that sense can vary from time to time, person to person, city to city. But what let's just call it cult worship of the emperor, not the emperor, but what the cult worship of Caesar provided is a collected identity that was dependent on the structure that they existed in. This is why this is very similar in a sense to how, of all things, communism can become very quickly cultish, worship of the government, and panentheism, which is sort of worship of the environment, worship as all things as God, or the earth, the Gaia as God, which is slightly distinguished from panentheism, produces a very cultish outlook. The thing that the Christians, because if you look at history also as the time when Christianity was persecuted by the Romans, it wasn't a 300-year consistent period of death in the Colosseum and being burned by Nero. Rather, there were peaks and valleys, spikes and moments throughout that period of time where suddenly there would be a great oppression of the church, not genocide, but a religicide of sorts, where the Christians were claimed by the Romans to be ruining their world, uprooting the foundation by which Rome was settled on, that foundation at the time being the rule of the Caesar, the rule of Rome. Christians appealed to a higher power. They appealed to God, and they said that they were more loyal to God than they were to the emperor. And this couldn't stand in an environment of that sort. Now, you had people who were troublemakers within the Roman system, and that was dealt with in different ways until Rome fell, not even fell, but Rome, until Christianity grew so large that Rome could no longer contain it. And so the voluntary participation in this sense this voluntary participation of the community in this sense could almost be seen as an allegory to life before Christ and life after Christ. There's even a New Testament biblical principle about this where Peter, who is talking he's talking about being a Jew in this time, meant something. It was there was a tribalistic aspect to it, and then it was opened up to much more of a inviting community, voluntary participation. This is why the church is entirely voluntary. So, How does this apply to the world that we live in right now? Well, we desire to be a part of something, and for many of us, whether through familial decisions, economic waylays, refugee status, the terrors of the world, we have been separated from having this opportunity of tribe, because we no longer have that collected identity with everybody. We leave the military, we move from town to town, we exist in a world where the things that we believed that we were going to center ourselves on no longer exist. So the problem that we're faced with is that it is no longer a given that you have a community to be a part of. And just because it's no longer a given doesn't mean that you don't have that need or desire or hunger for something like that. But what that it reveals to us is that if you want to be in a part of a community, you have to volunteer to be a part of it. You have to step forward and say, here I am, send me. You have to choose to be a part of a community. It will not be given to you. If gun culture wants community to be given to it, it will be sorely disappointed. If people desire to be in community with one another, they cannot passively wait by for it to happen. You must go out and choose those you spend your time on, and do so deliberately. It will be painful. It will require humility, but in the end, it will be worth it. We may make mistakes, we may fall, we may stumble, we may make bad decisions, but if we choose to isolate ourselves and abdicate that, we will find ourselves starved of something that we need and or desire. To close it off, the difference between a tribe and a tribalism is that succeeds when people do so voluntarily. They acknowledge their collected history. They desire to build more into that tradition. They add to its value, and by doing so, they add value to those within the tribe. Those within the tribe are saying that, in the sense, I'm willing to forego making the ambiguous everything out there better in order to make what I have influence over my commitments to better. That reflects within community. If you want to be a part of community, you have to build into it. Whether you are leading it, whether you are following it, whether you are financing it, whether you are entertaining it, whether you are engaging in it, whether you are leading it, whether you are being a part of it, whether you are just existing within it, you cannot be a part of community if you do not volunteer to be a part of one. No one's going to come around and grab you and say, I want you to be a part of this. Or if they do, consider yourself lucky. It's rare. And we have to be aware of a cult in a sense, because a cult will subjugate, prohibit your participation, instead saying that your purpose is now to serve the cult in a way that, well, we can even get more thorough, but warnings against the cult are dangerous because it offers the prohibition of your choice for the sake of the cult or whatever. It is an abdication of thought for the access to secret knowledge. It tempts with being enlightened. You have to be careful about such things. In the same way that tribalism is just, well, a small way of thinking about the world. You are forsaking the possible future of you and your tribe because you are simply abdicating your agency. That being the case, that as we're going about this time of rebuilding in communities, do not look for somebody else always to build it for you. If you have one to join it. Do not be afraid in the sense, because the people who volunteer to join it are like you. They have to humble themselves to be part of something greater than themselves. And in the same way, do not forget that you are responsible to how you think. You cannot abdicate that to somebody else. You are responsible to what you believe. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. And as we go forward in our world, and as we continue to build communities, and we continue to live in this day and age, we have a choice. If you want a team room, you have to build a team. If you want to build a team, you have to be worthy of it. If you want to be worthy of it, you have to volunteer. It cannot come across by manipulation. There is no free lunch in this sense. So, if this is you, I implore you, go out and find those in your area, go out and find those in other places, but do not give up on it. Do not isolate yourself. There are those out there that are looking for you to be a part of it, and if you find yourself constantly on the outside of groups, ask yourself if it is you. Are you refusing to humble yourself, or are you standing by principles? Do not get those two mixed up. Because if you're refusing to recognize that you are a part of something, that you want to be a part of something, but instead you are just being do not forsake your principles. Do not forget to be humble. These two things live in tension. We must do them at the same time. That being the case, if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com, or you can jump in on the pre-order for our shirts, our classic shirts. That this is the last time they're going to be available for pre-order for a while. We're going to try to get them in the shop in the future, but there's no promises because we have to get this pre-order done. We've also set the price at shirts a little bit lower than what we normally do because we want to get these out, and we want to get these to you. We're also doing our hoodies, and hoodies will deliver before it gets too cold. We've opened this pre-order, which closes at the end of July. So if you want to support us through merch, we appreciate it. If you want to keep this channel growing, if you want to be a part of the community, you can find us at Locals, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. We're traveling around the world. That's why the background keeps changing if you're looking at us on YouTube. So that being the case, there's more to follow. Thank you very much. Go forth and conquer.